Learning from the local. Introduction. More than ever before, the practice of architecture is consumed with complexity and contradiction, even more so than Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown might ever have imagined when they opened architects' minds to the joys of uncertainty in Learning from Las Vegas, which challenged the limiting orthodoxies and dogmas of Le Corbusier's Vers une architecture. The Venturi-Scott Browns showed us, if we are curious and open-minded, we can embrace all types of architecture. Perhaps the most prescient, overriding and dominant global social and cultural concern of recent years is the tussle between the local and the universal. It's dominated politics, food, environmental issues, and of course, architecture. Once, it was easy for buildings to effortlessly speak of their places as they were bound up in multiple ecosystems, cultural, technical, economical, and material, that made it hard to the point of impossibility for buildings not to speak of their places, even if their creators had constructed an abstract narrative that removed a building's conception from its locale. Now we have the reverse problem. It's harder for buildings to speak authentically of their places. By speak, I really mean form their identities via associations with geographical places, although, as I shall show, geography alone doesn't define a building's relationship with the local. But why is it harder now, and why should buildings speak of their places? These two questions are related because there is not necessarily a should in architecture. Buildings can speak of anything, and architecture is a vehicle with which we use to tell stories. There are multiple ways to tell stories with architecture, and thankfully contemporary architecture is, if nothing else, healthy in its diversity and plurality. This book is not a reductive manifesto setting out how architecture must do certain things. More, within the breadth of architectural ways of doing and being, this book explores how architecture can do certain things. Within all of the multiple dialogues and among the breadth of architecture that will and should continue to embrace different modes of expression, we yearn for buildings to speak convincingly of place. Simone Weil has written about this in The Need for Roots, which concerns the contemporary world's disconnection with the past and the loss of community, and how, to an extent, life was known as something that had lost its moorings and became uprooted in a world defined by the power of large, abstract entities. This desire for the rootedness of place exists because most people from most cultures are drawn to the particular rather than the general, and the specific rather than the universal. Environmental psychology conceives of the relationship between people and places as working both ways. As Winston Churchill said, we shape our places and they shape us. We travel to gain new experiences of people and places that are distinct from the ones we know in other contexts. And the built environment is, more than any other endeavour, the method through which people and cultures express themselves and their identities in a concrete and lasting manner. We used to build in a way that was so self-evidently bound up in local identity, and this is also increasingly difficult when we are increasingly conflicted. We're conflicted because it's not easy to reconcile a yearning for the local with the demands of the global. While value is culturally specific, it's a truism to suggest that regardless of context, even if we want to design buildings that can speak meaningfully of places and the cultures, materials, customs, and identities that come with them, it's not easy to do in a manner that has the same direct meaning as pre-industrial vernacular architecture. Now, we desire the same level of meaning and connection from buildings, but without the same direct relationships that gave buildings meaning and located them somewhere. We don't have a universally applicable way of achieving this in the same way that was the default mode pre-industrial revolution, taking material from the ground, close to a site, and marrying it with local available skills. Largely because of the power of global supply chains, it's never been harder to source material from one place, as we did pre-industrial revolution, and use it to make local buildings that meet the demands of the 21st century. It is possible to use local material in an economical and direct way to make, say, a primitive hut. But for anything beyond that, the economic efficiencies and ruthlessness of these global supply chains make it almost impossible. Now, material sourced locally is exponentially more expensive than that from the other side of the world. It's cheaper and easier in the basalt region of Spain to import basalt from Mongolia. Few people in North Wales can afford to use the slate quarried in North Wales when compared with Chinese slate. And also, the requirements of the 21st century are such that we don't necessarily need primitive huts. The world is increasingly urbanised, and it is important that we live densely, often in medium-rise buildings, and that we share resources. And yet, in part because of rural to urban migration, which has become so predominant in the developing world, and places become more similar due to globalisation, how can we use buildings to satisfy our fascination for the particular? If it was once almost impossible not to build in a manner that spoke of a place or a region, a culture or a community, and with that, build in a manner that made sense culturally, economically and environmentally, now it is extremely difficult. At least it's difficult to do in a meaningful or economical manner. Skills are transferable, and free movement of labour is a positive thing. The free movement of material is more complex. This book is not a plea to return to pre-industrial times, but more an endeavour to understand the provenance of the local in a global culture that allows us to build anything, anywhere, with anybody. Whilst there's a huge interest in the vernacular, buildings are not made meaningfully by slavishly copying or referencing or reflecting the formal characteristics of buildings that grew up in particular places in a relatively short window in human history, typically globally the 18th and 19th centuries up to the Industrial Revolution, and then fixing them forever, irrespective that the same constraints that gave rise to these buildings no longer exist. Should we use Cotswold stone in the Cotswolds forever? Even if this necessitates using imitation stone, should we only make neoclassical buildings in Bath? Should we design pitched-roofed agricultural referencing buildings in all rural areas until global warming pushes us over the edge or Elon Musk leads a mass exodus to Mars? And even if we can find ways to make architecture super local, isn't it perhaps a little parochial and a little too, cuddly? Or if it isn't, how do we reclaim the local from small-minded nationalists? How can we embrace the local and be connected to the world and contemporary issues that go beyond burying our head in the sand or the clay or the mud? The other conundrum regarding cost concerns carbon cost. In 20 years, the embodied carbon proportion of buildings has grown from about 20% of a building's overall carbon footprint relative to its operational carbon of 80%. And transportation of materials is a significant proportion of this. Simply, when materials are sourced locally, carbon emissions are reduced. As mentioned, using local material is often financially prohibitive, but this is where design comes in. If we can't afford to quarry local stone and use it directly, what can we use? There are a few off-the-shelf solutions to local low-carbon materials that are locally responsive, but there are inventive ways of using or reusing materials sourced extremely locally, as rural studios show with their experiments in finding uses for waste materials, or with students at Hook Park with their uses of waste or low-grade timber earmarked for pulping. These approaches to materials are exciting architecturally, they're low carbon, and they also suggest ways that through design we can be freed from the tyranny of default material choices rooted in a cursory reading of a historical vernacular. This book is about all of these things, and it's structured around a series of chapters around a particular theme, with 4 specific case studies per chapter that collectively present a cross-section of projects from around the world that collectively demonstrate a diverse range of approaches in how certain aspects of the global have been reconciled with the concerns of the local. Although architects have always been desperate for the certainty of a creed as a closed system, be it classicism or modernism or postmodernism, deconstructivism, neo-vernacular, high-tech or whatever, this book doesn't provide a simple manifesto or roadmap. As more than anything, architecture is a shifting target and has a complicated relationship with the contingencies of the social, political, economical and material worlds. But it does perhaps show how we can reconcile the local and the global, and how buildings can engage with their context in convincing ways to have meaningful encounters with places and people, and to take part in a rich and evolving narrative of locally responsive architecture that is both low carbon and a true reflection of the circumstances of its production.